This lesson is all about how children learn to read. Why do I call it a journey? Learning to read isn't something that begins in the first grade or kindergarten or wherever it is in your country that children learn to read formally. They actually start learning to read from a very young age. So when do children learn to read? Well, they actually start to develop these skills from birth. And it's a long journey of a few years. They need to develop a lot of skills in order to set them up for learning to read formally when they're actually starting to put the sounds together and make words with them. Now, language is a natural process. Babies are born to learn language. They listen to their parents speaking to them and they listen to their families, and before long they start mimicking and they start speaking. Reading is not a natural process to humans. It's actually a man-made process. So in order for your child to learn to read properly, he or she actually needs to develop a whole lot of skills to set him up for that. Now, your child needs to develop sound knowledge, also known as auditory perception, and symbol knowledge, known as visual perception. Sounds and symbols are what make up reading. Now, English is a very funny language. I'm sure you'll agree with me. You can have one symbol that has multiple sounds. For example, a C is a S in city or a K in cat. And you can have one sound that has multiple symbols to represent that sound. For example, a F sound can be a PH in elephant, an F in fight, a double F in puffy, or a GH even. So learning to read and write English certainly is no easy feat. Now, reading is not just about learning the 26 letters and their sounds. There is such a huge focus on these 26 letters. Parents seem to think that only once they've learnt the 26 letters are they able to read. But actually, I think that's because it's a measurable milestone, perhaps, that can be measured. So they know that if their children have learnt the 26 letters, that they are definitely learning. But actually, the learning is happening the whole time. You just need to know what to look out for. So the 26 letters and their sound are probably somewhere towards the end of the journey of learning to read, and I'll explain that better now. So it's not about learning those sounds, it's about developing pre-reading skills, and these are the pre-reading skills. Number one is print awareness, and this means that your child is able to look around at print and see that it conveys meaning. So you can look at a stop street and understand that there's a message on there. You can read food containers in a shopping center and understand that they're giving information about the food. Or when you read your child a bedtime story, at some point your child starts to understand that the book is actually writing the message and that you are reading it. You are actually decoding those funny symbols on the page. The second one is motivation to read. So your 1-year-old has no motivation to read. She's not mature enough yet. There's just no desire. Your 3-year-old, many parents like to force their 3-year-olds to learn to read. It's not ideal because your 3-year-old doesn't really have that burning desire to decode. Your 3-year-old is enjoying listening to you reading the story or pointing out the signs. He or she is still far too immature to actually want to read on their own. Number 3 is listening comprehension, and this is something that you can develop, especially through reading to your child. So listening comprehension means that your child can listen to a story, grasp what they're hearing, discuss it with you, remember it, etc. And you can read to your 2-year-old, and it's very good to read to your 2-year-old, but he's unlikely to be able to recall the entire story back to you. So this is something that develops with age and maturity, and it's very, very important to develop before formally learning how to read. Number 4 is letter knowledge. So here you have your 26 letters. It's a part of the pie, but it's certainly not the most important part. And the most important part, and this is what's going to set your child up for reading success or not, is whether their phonological awareness is developed. That means that your child has honed their ears to actually work with sound. It's not about memorizing 26 letters. It's about, can your child perceive different sounds, put them together, blend them, separate them, etc. So your child needs to develop their auditory skills first. They must be able to hear sounds and words. Now, I've written basic words versus blends because if you are a parent who really wants to teach your 3-year-old to read, and I know there are a lot of parents who do want to, I'm not sure why they want to do that. It's not going to really help the child. Your child might appear slightly ahead for the first year in school, but is probably going to fall behind later, because if you give a young child a basic word such as k, they can memorize those sounds and they can put them together. Even a very young child can do that. But as soon as you start introducing blends, so a word like snack, where you're putting S and an and a and a k that's made up of a C and a K, it starts becoming difficult. Or if you put sight words in, sight words where you can't really sound them out. So what I often found in my class when I was teaching is that those who'd learned to read at a very young age, they were pretty quick with their basic words, but by probably halfway through the first year that I was teaching them to read, those kids were already falling behind the others, because the others had actually developed this phonological awareness. They'd actually spent more time playing, ironic as that sounds, and those kids were actually able to work with sounds, so they could put sounds together, break sounds apart, hear the difference, etc., etc. So auditory perception is the ability to hear sounds in words, and this needs to be developed. It's a major pre-reading skill. Just 3 aspects of auditory perception. This isn't all of them, but 3 aspects. Auditory memory is the ability to remember what you've read. Discrimination is to tell the difference and similarities between sounds, and auditory figure ground. So, for example, you're listening to my voice and you're hopefully blocking out the sound of the traffic outside my house that's going past. So you're listening to the teacher in class and you're not listening to the birds outside. And some children struggle to do that. They struggle to actually focus on one thing, or the most important thing that they should be listening to. Now, different activities that you can do to develop the skill. It's very basic activities. You need to be singing rhymes and songs with your children for years, playing word games, listening games like broken telephone, rhyming games, following instruction games. And these games are all games that are in the activity pack. So there are many, many different types of games you can play. So phonological awareness, this is part of auditory perception, but more specific, this is dealing with the differences and similarities in sounds. Now, in order for children to learn to read successfully, they must be able to hear the initial sounds in a word, the end sounds, and the middle sounds, which is easier said than done. It's a skill that requires practice. They need to be able to blend sounds together, and they need to be able to break up sounds. So here's an example of an activity you can do with your child. Try this and see. It's not as easy as it looks. Ask your child to say pancake and then now say it again without cake. Now your child has to hold the word in their memory, the 2 words, pancake, remove cake, and then say the answer is pan. It's not as easy as it looks. And another example, you can say mat, and then say mate, and say, do they sound the same or do they sound different? And there are many advanced examples that you can do of these kinds of activities. And then next, after auditory perception comes visual perception. So this is the ability to see the patterns in letters and words. So visual perception is made up of skills like visual memory, the ability to remember what you see, visual discrimination, seeing the similarities and differences, etc. Visual tracking. Visual tracking means that a child is able to follow where they are on the page. So this is something that actually needs to be learnt long before you start introducing formal reading, because they need to be able to see where they are and follow on the line. They need to be able to see patterns. This is something you can do with puzzles, for example. Isn't that interesting that doing puzzles is actually going to help your child's visual perception, which will make them better readers. And reading from left to right. So reading from left to right seems like an obvious skill, starting on the left as you go to the next line, but it's not easy if a child, for example, hasn't built their midline crossings ability. And that is something you do while playing. And midline crossing means your child is able to cross the right arm over to the left-hand side of the body and vice versa. And if they don't develop this, then they actually struggle when they're reading to start on the next line. They actually start reading from halfway or somewhere along the line. Reading difficulties. So in my experience, children seldom have reading difficulties, problems because they didn't memorize the 26 letters early enough. The problems can usually be attributed to poor visual memory, tracking, auditory perception, etc. So in conclusion, learning to read is a journey. Focus on the pre-reading skills through play. Don't rush learning the letters. However, don't stop natural learning. So if your child is asking you what the word says, asking you what the sound is, putting them together naturally, then you want to run with that. So that means your child is learning naturally and it's actually meaningful for them. So yeah, definitely don't stop any progress that they're making on their own, but certainly don't push those 26 letters. They will come very easily when all the pre-reading skills are in place.